Well, it's interesting what you said about the efforts historically by the United States to have some respectability to its empire, because over the past 30 years, this has been done mainly under what they refer to often as the rules-based international order. I often trace it back to Kosovo, because they said, well, it's not legal, but it's legitimate. So why is it legitimate? Well, they refer to liberal democratic values, giving a exemption to international law, which is obviously the sole prerogative of the political West under U.S. leadership. So, this is why it's a bit strange. Why didn't Trump take this approach of legitimizing it? Because the Europeans tried to offer this. I mean, in my country, in Norway, they gave this as a layup. We gave the Nobel Peace Prize to Machado, who was essentially calling for military interventionism, putting her in power, and this would be. And then we say, well, yes, that would be democracy, that would be freedom. So giving it this legitimate route, but it's, well, not real legitimate, but, well, nonetheless, Trump went the other way, saying this is our oil, narco-terrorism, all of this more, let's call it unconventional ways of using the military force in this manner. Why do you think he didn't go down this preferable path by the Europeans, that is liberal democratic wars?
He despises the whole notion of liberal democracy. But the difference between him and the so-called liberal Democrats is he says so. He doesn't wrap himself up in the flag of liberal democracy. You mentioned Kosovo. I think this is a brilliant example. When the Europeans kick and scream that Putin should never be rewarded or allowed to get away with changing international borders through bombardment, through war, what were they doing when they were bombarding Belgrade against international law by destroying the rules-based international order? The answer that Clinton would give are freedom, democracy, high humanistic values. But everybody in the United States knows now that this is all rubbish. Nobody takes the Clintonite liberal democratic narrative seriously. It has been absolutely discredited. It was discredited primarily in Iraq. Supposedly they moved into Iraq in order to bring democracy. Now you utter the word democracy in Iraq and people hide under the table because they think they will be bombed. So, thousands of Americans were killed in Iraq, supposedly for democracy. 1 million Iraqis were killed. And remember that, Obama and Trump share one campaign. They both campaigned against the invasion of Iraq. The difference was that the moment Obama moved into the White House, he started doing the same thing. He did the same thing in Libya. And he justified turning Libya into a place that is impossible to imagine civilization coming back, with Hillary Clinton being at the forefront of that, again, on the basis of liberal democratic values. And, by that time, by the time Libya was turned into killing fields on the pretense of spreading democracy by Obama, who supposedly was the man who was against Bush doing the same thing in Iraq, this whole project of regime change and bringing democracy using the United States military might was totally discredited. And it was Trump who inherited the mantle of fighting against it. But Trump comes from, real estate, and he looks at everything as a real estate deal. And he says, okay, now, what Obama said, what Bush said, what the Clintons did in Kosovo and so on, this was all hypocrisy. It undermined the interests of the United States. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut deals, and I'm going, whenever I need to snatch territory from somebody, I will. But I will be honest. I will say that I'm simply snatching it because I want it. And that's it. And, I think that deeply cynical people in the United States, made cynical by, a sequence of administrations that lie to them about the purpose of military interventions, at least appreciate the honesty of the man. He says, tomorrow he will look at Norway and say, I want Norway. And, some people, the only disagreement amongst his base would be, do we really want Norway or not? Not is it right to covet Norway? That discussion now has been won by the gangsterism, which is so naked and so profound in the face of Donald Trump.
I made the point when they renamed it to the Department of War that I actually appreciated on some level the honesty, because war is the political propaganda is always selling war as peace, making the horrible seem virtuous. So I do appreciate the honesty, but what are the consequences for Europe though? This kind of new honesty in terms of giving its stamp of approval, because the EU is it's not a state. It's very much built up around the ideas of common values and ideals. So if you only look over the past years now, of course the Europeans, as you said, were quite outraged when Russia went into Ukraine, but the Russians said, NATO is building up a proxy on our border, we can't accept it, but now we have to continue. We can't even have diplomacy with the Russians because we're apparently so outraged. But when it came to Gaza, we saw the Germans and the EU in general, they referring to international law, but they're still backing the genocide. And now we see Venezuela, instead of focusing on the international law, kidnapping of a state leader and, of course, killing all of these people, we refer to now as the illegitimacy of Maduro because he's a dictator. So what will be the consequences for the EU project? Because if we don't have the ability to have an economic purpose of the EU because it's diminishing, and we don't have the values they keep referring to, or the commitment to international law, what do you think is going to happen to the EU as a consequence of this?
Well, the European Union has managed to project the image of the utmost hypocrisy and incompetence and impotence. Hypocrisy, impotence, and incompetence. This trifecta of disasters that has befallen the European Union. Remember how I started our conversations? My first answer to your question was that the first thing that came to mind when Trump grabbed and abducted Maduro just because he felt like it was to think that Putin is seeing his own legitimization through this act, that he felt that he managed to Putinize the White House. And what was the first reaction of Ursula von der Leyen? That she's monitoring the situation. That was the height of the moral argument that she made, that she's monitoring the situation. Not a word of condemnation, of criticism. Of what? Of the kind of action that legitimizes Putin. So, the Europeans are not even consistent in pursuing a policy, a kind of philosophy, a line, a narrative, which admonishes the acts of the man whom they consider to be the number one threat to the European Union, Putin. They don't understand that. What is that they don't understand, really? I mean, Glenn, Donald Trump has never missed an opportunity to say that he loathes the European Union, that he considers the European Union to be a threat and an enemy to the United States, that he wants the European Union to be dismembered. I mean, he doesn't hide it. And yet there they are. They arrive in the White House, they sit like children in front of daddy. They call him daddy, Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands and currently the Secretary General of NATO, has called him daddy and said, daddy's right. And you have Ursula, and you have, Friedrich Merz, and you have Macron, and you have Keir Starmer keeping their mouth shut. And, then 2 days later, they come up with the idea that, but you shouldn't take Greenland. Well, if I take Venezuela, why can't I take Greenland? Why can't I take Scotland if I want to? Who's going to stop me? So, it is. I never expected that in my, later decades of life, I would see Europe being so utterly, purposely, and in a self-inflicted manner humiliated. I mean, they are shooting themselves in the foot every day. I mean, the Greek Prime Minister, as I said before, came out and said that, Maduro had to go. This is not the time to think about international law. And, immediately Glenn, immediately, here I am in Greece. This is the Aegean. On the other side, there is Turkey. Turkish politicians, quite rightly so, came out and said, "Oh, this is amazing news, magnificent news. The Greek prime minister has just done away with 100 years of the Greek government's or the Greek state's argument that the best defense shield for Greece vis-a-vis Turkey is international law." Unforced errors, they call this in tennis.